clearly there's a lot that one can look forward to as far as the Union Budget 2024 is concerned. But we here at Mirror Now are going to break down different sectors for you in terms of expectations, whether it's startups, personal tax, health, education, and urban infrastructure, or even environment for that matter. So let's begin with startups. What are the expectations in the budget 2024? We're going to be putting out those graphics on your screens for you to better understand that. So one point would be scrapping or reduction of the angel tax. Let's also tell you as far as expectations under this sector is concerned, simplification of compliance burden, that is taxation norm schemes to boost domestic investments and sector-specific budgetary allocations. But extremely important when we talk about startups as well, one of the major expectations here would be early stage startups, support for the same, which is probably one of the key pointers as far as expectations for this particular sector is concerned. Now, we've spoken about startups. Like I said, we're also going to break down many other sectors for you. Having said that, what are the expectations when it comes to personal tax budget, right? Let's quickly first talk about the 2023 changes, simplified tax slabs in the new regime, remember? And the new tax regime made the default option, which we did see when it was announced last year. The rebate limit in the new tax regime was hiked to 7 lakhs and increased limits for presumptive taxation. Let's also tell you what happened essentially in 2023, just to jog your memory down. Taxation on gifts above a certain amount, that would be 50,000 from residents. But as far as personal tax budget is concerned, clearly it is the common man who would want to have certain sort of expectations from the 2024 budget. So what we essentially showed you were the changes that happened in 2023. So what are the expectations this year? Number one would be increase in standard deduction, expansion of tax slabs and rates. Of course, the other pointer here being increased deduction limits on investments. Also with the fact that when you're talking about personal budget, expectation being expenses, inclusion of more allowances and benefits. Also, a very key point over here would be simplification of tax compliance. So we've spoken about startups, we've spoken about personal finance as well in terms of taxation, of course. But a very key important sector as far as budget is concerned would be the health sector. So if we were to break that down for you, let's begin by talking about what really transpired in 2023 as far as those changes that were made, which is why then one would better understand what kind of expectations one would have for 2024. Number one being, in this particular sector, the allocation was hiked by 3.43% to 89,155 crore. The National Health Mission was strengthened, that is 33% of the budget. Let's also break that down for you. As far as the Prime Minister Swasthya Suraksha Yojana was expanded, you're also looking at that key pointer on your screens right now. Let's also tell you as far as the changes that we did see on ground was new aims, upgrading the existing medical colleges, promotion clearly of Ayurveda and traditional medicine. But like I said just a couple of minutes back, these were the changes that we saw in 2023. So let's see how that's aligning with the expectations of 2024. These are, of course, just expectations. In a few hours from now, we'll really know the big game, or rather the numbers that will unfold. So let's talk about the first point here. The expectation from the health sector, number one being increased allocation for healthcare that you're looking at, new hospitals. Right, that would be another main aspect of it, where primary healthcare centers as well. Let's also talk about the other pointer over here being increased funding for research and development, which is key for the health sector. Talking about facilities, if one were to talk about the health sector, especially in the rural areas, the expectation here would be improved facilities in this specific area, that is. Let's also talk about insurance, right? Health insurance that most of us have, rightly so. Tax benefits would be one particular expectation as far as the health insurance is concerned. Now, we've broken down health sector as well. Another very important sector when it comes to not just the budget allocation, but what has really transpired in 2023 and what can one expect as far as 2024 is concerned in the sector, in the field of education. Now, in 2023, the budget, that is, the changes of the highest allocation for education, what you're looking at is 1.12 lakh. This is the number that we did see last year. Let's also tell you the other very important aspect of a change that we saw last year, midday meal allocation. Let's also tell you another, as far as this is concerned, what really transpired there was hiked by 20%. Let's also tell you another aspect as far as the education sector is concerned, which was a very interesting move, is that the National Digital Library for Children, as far as we talk about a very important aspect of the education sector, remember the Skill India aspect. So 30 Skill India international centers were put into effect. Also, there was special emphasis on digital education and infrastructure. We know how that has been the foundation, especially during when classes, of course, went virtual as well. So to strengthen that aspect, we did look at how emphasis on the digital education and infra was a big factor in 2023. But as far as expectations of 2024 are concerned, is it more or less on the same lines? What can one really expect? Let's get into that quickly as far as you're looking at those important points. Number one, let's begin with the fact that increased budget allocation for infrastructure boost. Let's also talk about when we speak about education sector, there is an enhanced focus on digital education. That's essentially what we also broke that down for you in terms of what has, of course, happened already in 2023. But for 2024, will there be a different strategy? That remains to be seen. Let's also talk about a very important aspect, the education loan system. This is one of the expectations where reforms in the educational loan system is something that the common man would ideally want to look forward to. As far as GST reforms to make educational affordable, that would be very interesting to see if that happens, because these are expectations. And of course, the foundation of teaching being teacher training and development. So steps for strengthening that would be an expectation, considering the fact that we've seen the involvement of how the education sector has also grown. And in terms of the digital concept coming in, how would that also pan out would be very interesting to watch. But we did use a word even in the concept of the education sector, which was infrastructure, right? Ultimately building. So what is that going to be looking like in terms of infrastructure coming together? The budget 2023 changes for this particular sector. Now, for infrastructure, if you were to, go back to what really happened in 2023, there was a slight dip in the budget allocation. That is, you're looking at the number on your screens right now. That was 76,431 crores. But the concept of smart cities, remember, in 2023, if you were to look at that number that was allocated, it was 8,000 crore for the smart cities mission. Having said that, urban infrastructure development, that fund was particularly set up. We all know how important that is. Let's tell you the number would be 10,000 crore per year. Let's also tell you as far as changes were made in 2023 for this sector. Emphasis on improving municipal finances. But let's also tell you as far as what really happened in 2023 with the infrastructure sector, there was decline in Prime Minister Awas Yojana allocation. So that's a very important aspect. Would that change this year? Will that be an expectation where people want to see some sort of change? We'll get into that. But let's also tell you as far as Swachh Bharat is concerned, in 2023, the budget for the same mission, that is urban, doubled. And as far as we talk about infrastructure, there was a big hike in industrial corridor development. Now that we have rejogged your memory as to what really transpired with urban infra budget 2024, and now the expectation, we'll get into that, right? So with the expectations, number one would be increase in budget allocation. And primarily because the first point we spoke about in 2023 was how we saw a slight dip. So considering that, there is an expectation that this will be increased. Number two would be expansion of the Urban Infra Development Fund. Very important, considering how we do look at urban infrastructure really crumble at times. It will be essential to see how that allocation happens. But also picking up as far as expectations here are concerned, that incentives for private sector participation is a very important expectation, and focus on affordable housing. We all know how real estate prices have skyrocketed. So this would be one of the major expectations from urban infrastructure. Let's also talk about major reforms in urban governance. That is another important aspect when you're talking about urban infrastructure. 2024, this is, of course, everything to do with what one can expect today, and the governance emphasis on sustainable urban development. So we've spoken about all these particular sectors, this being, of course, urban infrastructure. But very essential to also talk about the environment and what is that sector looking like? What have we seen in the past that could probably give way to see the kind of changes that one would expect? Let's begin with the budget 2023 changes in this particular sector of the environment. So now the first one would be that the Environment Ministry allocated about 3,079 crore. So that was one major change that was made. Given the times that we're living in, the other point was, with the fact that we did see in 2023 was an increased focus on green growth. Let's also talk about with the fact that 35,000 crore towards energy transition was put into effect as far as the other change that was made. Now, when we're talking about allocation for budget in the year 2023, 19,700 crore was allocated for the National Green Hydrogen Mission. So clearly the foundation over there being, more towards that particular sector in environment. Let's also talk about 500 waste to wealth plants under the Govardhan scheme, which was another very important aspect of the particular change that we saw in 2023. Let's also tell you about the green credit program that we did see in 2023, the Armit, beg your pardon, Darohar Mishti. So that is, of course, in terms of what we saw in 2023 with all the changes. Again, does this sector really align with what we're looking at 2024? What are the expectations? As usual, of course, the first point would be it's a given that there is an expectation of increased allocation. But here, since we also spoke about how important green initiatives are, so in specific, if you're talking about the environment, a bigger boost, a bigger push, that would be right off the bat. Let's talk about renewable energy. Extremely important when you're talking about this sector. So one would essentially have an expectation of tax benefits. When we're talking about waste management, that's another very important aspect. You're talking about boosting waste management infrastructure. Infrastructure ultimately is what will give headway to this particular sector as well. Let's also talk about electric mobility sector. Now, in this particular sector, one could potentially, if you were to look at it and say, or even speak to experts, subsidies for electric mobility sector is one of the core expectations. Now, will that be allocated the way that one is looking at? Like I've said, it's only a matter of time that we'll know in a couple of hours from now. But let's also talk about a very interesting concept in terms of green buildings and urban planning strengthening, which is, of course, needed. So incentives for the same is what one could potentially look at when we're talking about the sector. But talking about strengthening in environmental regulations also, as well as enforcement, definitely the need of the hour. So that would potentially be why it is making a key point as far as expectations are concerned. So that's, of course, breaking down all the aspects as far as different sectors. Very interesting to compare what has happened in 2023 in terms of changes and 2024 with where things stand at the moment.